Think your communication channels are secure? Imagine living in a world where sending the wrong message at the wrong time wasn't just a personal mistake, but something that could plunge entire nations into chaos. That's not an exaggeration, it actually happened. Long before encrypted emails, satellites, or instant messaging apps, the world's most important secrets, strategies, and financial dealings depended on feathers and instinct. This is the unbelievable true story of Pigeon, a communication system that, while ingenious, carried with it the potential to destabilize governments, start wars, and upend economies. It was hailed as foolproof, but history shows us that foolproof is only a word until the fools put it to the test. The 19th century was an age of rapid change. Empires stretched across continents, railways carved paths through once isolated lands, and industrial power transformed society. But communication lagged behind. Letters could take weeks to arrive, sometimes months, depending on the distance. A single delay in relaying information could mean losing a war, missing out on massive financial opportunities, or letting uprisings grow unchecked. Against this backdrop, the humble homing pigeon emerged as a savior. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't new. Pigeons had been used to carry messages in ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. But in the 1800s, the bird's role transformed from quirky messenger to cornerstone of global communication. The pigeon's brilliance lay in its biology. No one fully understood why these birds could find their way home over hundreds of miles, but they did. Train them to return to a specific loft, tie a message to their leg, and they could deliver vital intelligence faster than any rider or courier. Militaries latched onto this with zeal. During sieges, when cities were cut off, pigeons were often the only way to get word in or out. In fact, entire pigeon corps were created within armies. The French famously relied on pigeons during the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, when Paris was surrounded. Messages micro-printed on tiny pieces of paper and attached to birds' legs were flown out of the besieged city, carrying news, orders, and morale. But pigeons weren't just for war. Banks, stock exchanges, and news agencies also embraced them. One of the most famous examples was in the 19th century financial world. A well-timed message about stock prices, commodity shipments, or political changes could make or break fortunes. Before telegraph lines connected everything, pigeons filled the gap. Imagine being a banker in London, waiting anxiously for news from the continent. A pigeon's arrival could mean the difference between profit and ruin. Agencies like Reuters even built their reputation on Pigeon, bridging communication gaps where telegraph wires had yet to reach. It all sounds brilliant, doesn't it? But here's the catch. For every strength the pigeons had, there was an equal and opposite weakness. The entire system hinged on fragile wings and human control. Lose the bird, and the message was gone forever. If it was shot down, intercepted, or even blown off course by a storm, sensitive information could fall into the wrong hands or vanish completely. Nations put unthinkable amounts of trust into these birds, and history shows us how that trust occasionally backfired with devastating consequences. Think about it this way. In modern terms, Pigeon was the equivalent of sending state secrets via text message on an unsecured phone. Anyone who caught the message mid-flight could read it, copy it, and exploit it. Enemies learned quickly that shooting down pigeons wasn't just sport, it was strategy. During wartime, skies became battlefields, not just for planes, but for flocks of messengers. Special units were tasked with intercepting pigeons. Knowing that one captured bird could shift the outcome of an entire campaign, but it wasn't only interception that made the system precarious. Miscommunication added another layer of danger. Pigeons were trained to return to one place, only their home loft. That meant messages could only travel in one direction. To send information back, you needed another pigeon trained to the opposite location. Lose track of which birds were assigned where, and chaos followed. Imagine the consequences if a pigeon carrying news of an advancing army flew to the wrong loft, arriving days late or never at all. History is littered with accounts of battles lost, uprisings mismanaged, and financial disasters triggered simply because a pigeon didn't make it or carried the wrong message. Yet governments doubled down on their reliance. The illusion of security made leaders bold. Because pigeons weren't tied to wires or roads, they seemed immune to sabotage. You couldn't cut a pigeon's line the way you could sever a telegraph cable. But this confidence was exactly what made the system so dangerous. Leaders and generals entrusted their most sensitive communications to birds. unaware that the very strength of the system, its simplicity, was also its fatal flaw. What makes this story so fascinating is how a bird could shape the fate of empires. Consider the French again during the Franco-Prussian War. Paris's entire survival strategy depended on pigeons carrying news out of the besieged city. Messages were shrunk to microscopic size, attached to the birds, and flown over enemy lines. But imagine the stakes. If even one of those birds was captured or failed, the government risked making crucial decisions blind. It's the equivalent of cutting off the internet to a modern city mid-crisis. The potential for missteps was enormous, and indeed, many errors were later traced back to delays and disruptions in pigeon post. Outside the battlefield, financial markets learned similar lessons. Traders who relied on pigeons to deliver stock prices from one city to another could find themselves ruined if a bird was lost or intercepted. Rumors could spread faster than facts, and by the time the truth arrived, ever-did fortunes had already been wiped out. The very speed of pigeon communication, which once seemed miraculous, could also accelerate panic when mistakes occurred. And let's not forget sabotage. Pigeons were vulnerable to everything from hungry hunters to rival agents. There are even recorded cases of rival groups painting pigeons to confuse their handlers or releasing decoys to disrupt communication lines. In one notorious case, birds carrying financial information were deliberately intercepted and delayed to allow competitors to get ahead in the market. The result was chaos, bankruptcies, and suspicion that lingered for years. All of this makes the pigeon post sound absurdly fragile, but in its time, it was considered revolutionary. And that is what makes it so chilling. People believed they had built a system that could withstand anything, when in reality, it was only ever a few feathers away from collapse. The fact that a bird could carry secrets that determined the fate of nations should make us pause and wonder just how fragile our own supposedly foolproof systems really are. So, the next time you assume your emails are private, your networks secure, or your secrets safe, remember the pigeons. The world once put its faith in them, only to discover that wings, no matter how fast, could never outrun the weight of human ambition and error. And if you've enjoyed this dive into one of history's strangest communication systems, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, because sometimes the most ridiculous stories carry the most unsettling truths. The disaster began not with a bomb, a battle, or a politician's speech, but with the beating of wings. In the world of high finance during the late 19th century, information was more valuable than gold. A single message delivered an hour earlier than the competition could build empires or ruin fortunes. For this reason, financial firms placed their trust in homing pigeons, the birds that could outrun trains, outpace ships, and deliver words faster than anything short of a working telegraph line. But in a system where timing meant everything, even the smallest error could snowball into disaster. And this time, it did. The message at the heart of the crisis was routine. An UFA financial report detailing market fluctuations in London that had to be communicated quickly to New York. The numbers contained inside would dictate whether investors bought, sold, or held their ground. In today's terms, it was like a real-time stock ticker, and whoever saw it first had the advantage. The London banker who drafted it had every reason to believe it would travel swiftly and securely. He tied it to the leg of a pigeon, a bird trained for speed and accuracy, and released it into the sky. But here lay the fatal flaw. The pigeon was not the seasoned veteran of dozens of flights. Instead, by oversight or sheer bad luck, it was a young, inexperienced bird one, not yet hardened by storms or long-distance routes. At first, the bird did what it was trained to do. It beat its wings furiously, cutting through the London air, aiming for its designated loft across the sea. But then the weather shifted. A storm swept across its path, tossing the bird into disarray. Inexperienced, it lost its bearings, spiraling away from its intended course. When it finally landed, drenched and exhausted, it had not reached its rightful destination. Instead, it fluttered down on the roof of a rival trading firm. This one mistake would alter the financial landscape. The rival firm discovered the message, read it, and instantly realized what they had stumbled upon. In their hands was information meant for a competitor, intelligence about the market that was hours ahead of schedule. They acted swiftly, buying up assets and selling others, moving before anyone else could react. To outsiders, it looked as if they had predicted the market with uncanny precision. Within minutes, whispers spread. How did this firm know? Why were they acting so aggressively? And most importantly, what did they know that no one else did? Panic works faster than reason. The rival firm's sudden movements created ripples across the financial community. Other investors, not wanting to be caught unprepared, scrambled to act as well. They began buying and selling in frenzy, trying to match the mysterious knowledge of their competitor. Prices swung wildly. Fortunes shifted in the span of hours. Those on the losing end faced catastrophic losses, while those quick enough to follow the trend reaped massive rewards. But this was only the beginning. News of the market volatility spread overseas. By the time word reached New York, it no longer mattered that the original message had been misdelivered. What mattered was that confidence had already been shaken. Investors in New York, seeing the chaos in London, assumed the worst. They speculated about political unrest, hidden wars, or sudden economic collapse. Fear, not fact, became the driver of decisions. It's important to understand just how fragile the financial system was in this period. Unlike today, where digital communication can correct errors in seconds, 19th century markets lived in a world of hours and days. If a rumor traveled faster than a correction, the rumor won. By the time anyone realized the truth that the entire chain reaction had begun with a pigeon losing its way there, damage was already done. The London banker who had released the bird could not have imagined the disaster he set in motion. For him, it was business as usual. Attach the message, trust the system, and let the pigeon fly. The idea that a single bird's mistake could trigger a global crisis would have seemed absurd. And yet, the reality unfolded before his eyes. By the end of the week, companies had gone bankrupt, personal fortunes had evaporated, and confidence in the Pigeon Post system had cracked. The irony was painful. The very system designed to bring security and reliability had been the cause of insecurity and instability. Investors who once praised pigeons as the miracle of modern communication now began to question whether feathers could really carry the weight of global finance. After all, what good was speed if it delivered the wrong message to the wrong hands? Imagine, for a moment, being a small investor in this storm. You've saved your entire life, putting your money into a bank or a firm you trusted. Then, one morning, you wake to hear that prices have collapsed because of mysterious trades and sudden shifts. You don't understand why. No one does. All you know is that everything you've built is suddenly gone. This was not a rare experience. For many ordinary people, the fatal flutter of that pigeon was not just a quirky footnote in history. It was the moment their lives unraveled. Governments and regulators were caught off guard as well. At first, many dismissed the event as a local financial mishap. But, as the panic spread, it became clear that the reliance on pigeons had introduced a dangerous vulnerability. Entire systems of trade, banking, and investment had been built on the assumption that pigeons were reliable. Yet here was proof that they were anything but infallible. It wasn't long before officials began asking serious questions. How many other errors had occurred unnoticed? How many fortunes had shifted not because of strategy or skill, but because of a bird's wing beat? The rival firm that had first received the misplaced message faced its own storm. They had profited, yes, but they were also accused of exploiting an accident. Were they guilty of market manipulation or merely opportunistic? The debates raged on in boardrooms and courts, but the damage to the global economy had already been written in the balance sheets of countless ruined investors. This single incident was a harsh lesson in fragility. It showed that a system could appear strong, efficient, and even revolutionary, but still hinge on the smallest, most unpredictable factors. The Pigeon Post had been celebrated as the Internet of its time, but like the Internet, it carried within it the seeds of chaos. All it took was one mistake, one bird, one storm, one wrong rooftop for the illusion of control to collapse. And so the fatal flutter was more than just a bird gone astray. It was the moment humanity learned that even the most ingenious systems are only as strong as their weakest link. In this case, that weakest link was a frightened pigeon blown off course, delivering not just a message, but the spark that ignited financial panic across continents. The unraveling did not stop at a single firm's clever advantage, or at the panic of local traders in London. What began as a misplaced pigeon and a misread message quickly metastasized into a worldwide crisis, proving proving how fragile the global economy already was in this era of rapid communication and international trade. When the rival firm acted on the intelligence they were never meant to see, they unwittingly set the first domino tipping. But every domino after that was waiting, perfectly lined up, ready to fall at the slightest touch. The false information embedded in that financial report spread like wildfire. Investors across Europe tried to interpret the sudden surge of trades from London, each guessing at hidden meaning. The supposed insider knowledge hinted at an economic downturn that wasn't real, but no one could be certain. This uncertainty created panic. Some investors pulled their money out of vulnerable industries like shipping and textiles. Others poured into gold, silver, and commodities. Believing the markets were about to collapse, by the end of the week, the false information from a single pigeon had sparked a self-fulfilling prophecy. What began as panic created the very crisis that traders feared. The collapse of confidence in London rippled outward across the Atlantic. In New York, brokers watched the British stock exchanges in disbelief. American papers reported the chaos, but with no reliable explanation for the erratic movements, they filled the gaps with speculation. Rumors of political upheaval in Europe circulated. Some claimed war was imminent. Others insisted a major empire was hiding evidence of financial insolvency. With little clarity, American investors made decisions based not on fact, but fear. That fear triggered mass sell-offs, dragging down markets in Boston, Philadelphia, and eventually Chicago. The Atlantic cable, still in its infancy and prone to technical failures, only muddied the waters further. When a clear message could not arrive, imagination replaced it. In Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, leaders of major trading houses faced the same problem. Their investors demanded answers for the sudden crash in values, yet no one could trace the root cause. Each nation saw the financial instability of its rivals and assumed hostile intent. France, for example, interpreted British economic movements as an attempt to manipulate grain markets against French interests. Germany believed France's sudden military expenditures actually just routines were in response to an unseen crisis. A pigeon error in London had now morphed into international paranoia, where nations suspected one another of foul play. Diplomats were soon entangled in the mess. Ambassadors sent urgent cables to their governments, demanding clarity. Each nation pressed its allies for reassurance and explanations. But because the financial collapse struck everyone at once, no single state had the ability to calm the storm. Miscommunication piled on miscommunication, and before long, suspicion bled into anger. Governments, already burdened with existing rivalries and territorial disputes, began to see economic moves as direct provocations. The British sale of government bonds was misinterpreted in Russia as an attempt to undermine Russian credit. A German increase in tariffs intended to protect domestic producers against volatile markets was read in France as a declaration of economic war. The domino effect had now extended far beyond economics. Financial panic, left unchecked, hardened into diplomatic crisis. In several nations, the press played a dangerous role. Newspapers thrived on sensationalism, and stories of rival nations conspiring against one another sold better than the truth that a bird had been lost in a storm. British papers accused German bankers of orchestrating a deliberate plot. German papers, in turn, claimed the British Crown was manipulating the entire market to strangle German industry. French editors suggested that both Britain and Germany were working together to bankrupt France before launching a land grab, with the public primed for outrage. Governments found themselves hemmed in by nationalist fervor and suspicion. In industrial cities across Europe and North America, factories cut production as investors pulled funding. Workers lost jobs, bread prices soared. Bank closures wiped out family savings. In villages, rumors spread that the crisis was engineered by elites to crush the common people. Protests erupted in major cities. What started as the faltering flight of one pigeon had now created social unrest from London to New York, from Paris to Berlin. The interconnected nature of 19th century finance amplified the crisis even further. Nations that relied heavily on imports or exports found themselves suddenly adrift. An unexpected surge in wheat prices destabilized the Ottoman Empire, where food security was already fragile. Even far-off colonies felt the impact, as the value of their exported goods plummeted overnight. From India to the Caribbean, colonial economies already on shaky foundations saw chaos, leaving populations confused and angry. Diplomats scrambled to salvage alliances strained by paranoia. Military officials grew nervous, interpreting the economic collapse as a prelude to war. After all, history had shown that nations often masked preparations for conflict behind economic maneuvers. If your rival was selling bonds, perhaps it was to fund an army. Such interpretations, built on nothing more than fear and faulty communication, brought the world closer to a cliff. At the heart of this global unraveling was the tragic irony. None of it had to happen. There was no secret conspiracy, no plot to destabilize markets, no preparation for war. There was only a storm-tossed pigeon, an accidental delivery, and a rival firm acting on information that should never have reached them. But once fear entered the bloodstream of the global economy, the facts no longer mattered. Perception became reality, and every reaction, no matter how small, fueled the chaos. The domino effect was not just financial or political, it was psychological. Leaders, traders, and ordinary citizens alike were swept up in a storm of uncertainty. Trust, the invisible glue holding economies and alliances together, evaporated almost overnight. Without trust, no treaty, no bank, no government policy could restore stability. Each nation acted defensively, protecting its own interests, but in doing so, deepened the crisis for everyone else. In hindsight, the lesson seems obvious. A single misstep, however trivial, can unravel even the most sophisticated systems. When those systems are built on fragile foundations, the Pigeon did not create international rivalries, economic fragility, or diplomatic mistrust, but it exposed them, accelerated them, and set them crashing into one another like falling dominoes. In the end, the global unraveling was less about the bird itself and more about the world it flew through a world, so tightly bound together that one misdelivered message could shake it to its core. The fallout from the disaster was nothing short of catastrophic. Once panic set in, the fragile scaffolding of society began to wobble. Markets collapsed, not because of real shortages of wealth or resources, but because trust, arguably the most valuable currency, had vanished overnight. The loss of confidence in financial institutions spread to governments themselves. Crowds stormed city centers, demanding answers from politicians who could barely explain what had happened, let alone provide solutions. In London, mobs gathered outside the Bank of England, smashing windows and demanding their deposits back. In Paris, food markets were looted when prices doubled within days, and desperate families rioted as bread became unaffordable. In New York, the panic took on a violent edge as factory workers, suddenly unemployed due to market collapse, clashed with police in brutal street battles. The financial panic bled directly into human suffering. When capital fled, businesses shuttered. Factories closed their doors. Shipments of food were delayed, not because supplies weren't available, but because no one trusted anyone to pay for them. Grain sat rotting in storage while hungry families lined up for scraps. In rural regions, farmers found themselves unable to sell their produce at fair prices. And in urban centers, the working poor faced the brunt of starvation and unemployment. The chain reaction of a misdelivered pigeon message had now transformed into a humanitarian disaster. The political costs were just as staggering. Governments already struggling to manage economic collapse now faced mass uprisings. In Vienna, the emperor's ministers resigned in quick succession, unable to manage the unrest. In Berlin, workers' strikes turned into political protests that demanded sweeping reforms. Monarchs and parliaments alike lost credibility, accused of being either too weak to stop the crisis or complicit in its escalation. Some nations teetered on the brink of revolution. Others descended into authoritarian crackdowns, where armies were deployed in the streets, not against invading armies, but against their own starving citizens. All of this chaos traced back, absurdly, to a bird. That absurdity only added fuel to the fire. Once the truth emerged that a pigeon's mistake had sparked the chain of events, people felt betrayed not just by governments and bankers, but by the very systems of communication they had trusted. If the world could descend into this much chaos over such a trivial error, how fragile was civilization really? The crisis became a mirror, reflecting back the uncomfortable truth that society had been resting on brittle foundations all along. And yet, from this devastation came a furious determination to ensure such a collapse would never happen again. The world's governments and inventors recognized that reliance on pigeons, charming as it was, could no longer be the backbone of global communication. A feathered failure, as it was mockingly called in the press, had proven that the stakes were simply too high. What was once seen as a quaint but efficient system was now regarded as dangerously primitive in an age of expanding global markets and political entanglements. This realization spurred an unprecedented wave of innovation. The telegraph, already in experimental use in some countries, suddenly became a matter of survival. Its ability to transmit messages instantly across wires promised to eliminate the uncertainty that pigeons, with their vulnerability to weather and human error, could never overcome. Within years, the telegraph network expanded at a breathtaking pace. Cities that once relied on pigeon lofts now strung wires across rooftops, building vast communication grids that tied capitals together. International lines stretched under the ocean, ensuring that London, New York, and Paris could share vital information in seconds rather than days. But it wasn't just the telegraph. The catastrophe also pushed serious investment into radio technology. Early experiments with wireless signals, once regarded as scientific curiosities, were now treated as critical projects. Inventors like Guglielmo Marconi found themselves backed by governments eager to find methods of communication immune to storms, rival interception, or feathered confusion. The world had learned its lesson the hard way. Speed and reliability were no longer luxuries, but necessities. This shift transformed not only communication, but governance itself. No longer could rulers claim ignorance of events unfolding beyond their borders. Information flowed too quickly. Decisions that once took weeks could be made in minutes. The collapse born from a pigeoness flutter forced nations to reckon with the fact that the speed of communication could determine the survival of governments. Slow, outdated systems were now seen as a direct threat to national security. The human cost of the fallout lingered for years, but so too did the determination to adapt. Pigeon lofts that had once been symbols of efficiency were dismantled or relegated to ceremonial roles. Banks and governments insisted on the adoption of telegraphic communication for critical exchanges, and international treaties began to include agreements on communication protocols, recognizing the shared vulnerability that all nations had suffered. Ironically, the same interconnectedness that had made the pigeon disaster so devastating also drove cooperation in building more resilient systems. Yet the memory of the catastrophe never fully faded. People whispered about it as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how close the world had come to unraveling entirely over a trivial accident. Parents told their children stories of the pigeon panic, mixing humor with horror, laughing at the absurdity while remembering the hunger and fear. In universities and lecture halls, historians debated how much of the collapse was caused by the bird itself and how much was due to deeper flaws in the global order. Economists pored over records, pointing out how the markets were already unstable and primed for disaster, and how the pigeon was merely the spark. But for the millions who lived through it, those arguments hardly mattered. What mattered was that they had watched their lives turned upside down, not by war or plague, but by a flutter of wings and a storm. They carried those memories into the new age of communication, wary but hopeful. As wires stretched across continents and antennas reached for the skies, the fallout had been devastating, but to fix the embrace of modern communication was revolutionary. It was a reminder, brutal and absurd, that sometimes the smallest mistakes reveal the greatest vulnerabilities. And from those vulnerabilities comes change, whether born of desperation, innovation, or the stubborn will to never let a bird decide the fate of the world again. The echoes of the pigeon disaster stretch far beyond its own century. What made the story unforgettable wasn't just the absurdity of a bird delivering the wrong message. It was what it revealed about the fragility of systems that people trusted without question. That is the true lesson, and it is just as relevant today as it was then. We may laugh at the idea of global markets collapsing because of a single pigeon-esque wrong turn, but the principle remains the same. When communication fails, trust collapses, and when trust collapses, the world unravels. The stakes haven't changed, only the medium has. We live in a digital age where carrier pigeons have been replaced by satellites, fiber optic cables, and sprawling networks that promise us instant, secure, and reliable communication. But history has a habit of reminding us that no system is immune to failure. If a single pigeon could spark a global panic in the 19th century, what could a single corrupted data packet or a hijacked message do today? The answer is unsettling. Take, for example, the vulnerability of modern financial systems. In today's world, trillions of dollars move across digital ledgers every single day. Markets rise and fall on the strength of a headline or the timing of a tweet. Imagine for a moment if a false financial report, fabricated by malicious code or planted by a hacker, were to circulate widely. Before it could be corrected, entire economies could buckle under the weight of fear and speculation, just as they did during the Pigeon incident. The butterfly effect of one small error or act of sabotage could be catastrophic, proving that we are not as far removed from those feathered failures as we might like to believe. Then there is the rise of deepfakes. In the Pigeon's time, misinformation traveled slowly. Today, it spreads at lightning speed and can be nearly impossible to distinguish from reality. A single deepfake video of a world leader declaring war, releasing false financial guidance, or even issuing emergency instructions could unleash chaos before the truth has any chance to catch up. If an old world market could be shaken by a bird flying off course, how much more damage could a fabricated image or video indistinguishable from the real thing? Because in our interconnected world, we've already had glimpses of this vulnerability. In 2013, a single hacked tweet from a major news outlet's account falsely claimed that explosions had occurred at the White House. Within minutes, billions of dollars evaporated from the stock market before the truth was revealed. The incident passed quickly, but it was a sobering reminder that even the tiniest disruption in trusted communication can send shockwaves across the globe. It was the Pigeon problem all over again, only this time it was measured in keystrokes rather than wingbeats. Massive internet outages provide another modern parallel. In 2021, a single misconfiguration at a major content delivery network took down huge portions of the internet for hours, disrupting everything from online shopping to government websites. While it wasn't deliberate sabotage, the outage revealed just how fragile the backbone of our communication has become. Businesses lost millions, critical services were interrupted, and panic spread online. The infrastructure may be digital, but the vulnerability is strikingly familiar. This is why the story of the Pigeon disaster refuses to fade into obscurity. It isn't just a strange footnote in history. It's a warning, a reminder that trust in communication is as essential as food or water. Without it, societies crumble. The Romans learned this with signal fires. The 19th century learned it with pigeons, and we are still learning it with servers, satellites, and algorithms. Each era develops systems it believes to be foolproof, only to discover that nothing truly is. The lesson then is not that pigeons were foolish, or that digital systems are inherently dangerous. The lesson is that no matter how advanced our tools become, human societies remain fragile when trust in communication breaks down. A pigeon veering off course, a hacker slipping into a system, or a storm knocking out undersea cables, all share the same dangerous potential. They remind us that the thread binding the modern world together is far thinner than we care to admit. What keeps this story so haunting is its absurdity. People expect empires to fall to war, plague, or famine. They do not expect them to tremble at the flap of a wing or the glitch of a machine. And yet, history has shown us repeatedly that the smallest things can reveal the greatest cracks. The people who lived through the Pigeon disaster carried that memory with them. Just as our generation will remember the days when a single cyber attack, a single outage, or a single fabricated video nearly brought the world to its knees. It is easy to dismiss the story of a pigeon causing chaos as a relic of a less sophisticated age. But the truth is more unsettling. We are not so different from those who trusted their feathered couriers. We too put immense faith in systems we barely understand, servers humming in the dark, lines of code moving unseen, satellites we never see orbiting above. And just like those bankers, generals, and politicians of the 19th century, we assume the system will not fail until, of course, it does. That's why the Pigeon story endures. It is not just about what happened then, but about what could happen now or tomorrow. The methods have changed, but the fragility remains. A single point of failure, whether bird or bite, can set off a chain reaction that nobody can stop once it begins. So the next time you hear about a cyber addict, a sudden internet outage, or a shocking piece of misinformation, Remember the pigeon. Remember how the world once unraveled not because of armies or disasters, but because a bird landed in the wrong place at the wrong time. It is absurd, yes, but also deeply human and a reminder that our greatest strength, the ability to communicate across distance, is also our greatest vulnerability. If you enjoyed this strange dive into history's forgotten warnings, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we explore the past's weirdest, most unbelievable stories and uncover the lessons they still carry for today.